Yes, another way that entry into cultures is through stories. Um, through stories. So we've talked about typical characteristics. Well, we can we can glean typical characteristics from stories. We can glean values and um, orientations towards life through the stories that are told, that we tell to ourselves, that are told to us, um, and myths are all around us. Today, it's very much well defined. A little bit of this, our culture, of course, is transformed in the last 20 years with the internet. But you think about YouTube is where we each get our individualized stories, of the world, and this is where myths are created now through technology, through the internet. So you go, but still, we have primary myths that still exist that we all can reference. And one of the oldest stories of Western culture, that still is very prevalent today, is Cinderella. Just do a little Google research on Cinderella, you'll see that it goes back to the 17th century. Um, and it has hundreds of versions of itself, that have completely kept to a similar storyline. But let me ask you this: when you hear of a Cinderella story, what is it that you automatically reference? What does it say to you? The Cinderella story.
Like a poor girl that gets, or and like beat up girl that gets a chance to be a royal person or like marry a prince.
Yeah, yeah. So that's sort of the through line, right? That's kind of the baseline for Cinderella, but it's used in a very generic way, also. Like the Cinderella story, whenever a sports team comes from behind, and or rises from the bottom of the cellar to the top. That notion of Cinderella story is very generalized in its reference point, applied to so many different contexts now. It's interesting though, the story of Cinderella. There's Asian versions that go back to the ninth century, excuse me, the ninth century, that it can be referenced. But Cinderella, and the Western telling of it has spread around the world, from European origin, of course, to Native American cultures as well. And so the Turkey Girl, your book talks about the Turkey Girl, in the opening chapter, and it shows how, in the Turkey Girl, the Zuni myth, was basically stolen from European telling and applied to the Zuni culture, and how it was applied is indicative of the differences between Western and Native American cultures in general. So we can really, this is such a great learning point, that you can really spend a lot of time sort of evaluating, this one particular story, and learning a lot about both cultures. And that's what anthropologists do. This is kind of, like I said, it's an entrance way into anthropology practice. So one of the things that we'll continue to talk about is this notion of selective bargaining, I almost said, selective borrowing, which, cultures change by interacting with each other. And so, you find that we're each culture, when two cultures come together, like a native, the Zuni culture, and the European American culture, when they collided, both stole from each other and applied it to their own culture. This is the diffusing of culture, that we'll talk more and more about as the semester unfolds. So there's this common ground that develops between two cultures, and with the Zuni myth, what you find with the Cinderella telling of in the Zuni telling of it from the European and Zuni overlap, in both stories you find this common ingredient. Women are caretakers, and they're the center of the story. They're the protagonist, and they both in both stories want to go to a dance, and they both are denied, but then they find their way to being allowed to go. And when they're allowed, they, in their own cultural context, act irresponsibly to what was expected of them. So, from the Cinderella storytelling of it, the European storytelling of Cinderella, um, what is the obviously what's the moral of the story? What is it that we what do we take away from this story? Anybody?
I guess we take away that uh, the mean stepmother in the end doesn't get what she wants, and the downtrodden girl gets to grow up and live a better life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay. So, but what is she? What she was being repressed, right? And
Yeah.
she, Ebony says, follow your dreams. Okay, so you have this diamond in the rough, right? That she has a talent or she has a beauty that's unrecognized, and evil was keeping her down. And so, um, in this story, of course, in Western ideology and Western values, is that if you keep trying, and if the good shall rise to the top, um, and follow your dreams. Yes. This is your virtue shall be rewarded at the end of the day. The individuality shall be rewarded. So this is in stark contrast to what happens with the turkey story. So in the Zuni story, the girl, she acts selfishly by neglecting her family, which in this story is the mythological story is it's a flock of turkeys. And because of her neglect of her going to the dance, going to the party, neglecting her family, um, she she loses her family, and her flock flies away. Um, and so, what is being said about Native American culture, and particularly specific Zuni culture? Um, what values are being portrayed here? What's
Family. Like you should hold your family higher than the individualistic virtues that you see in like the Western culture.
exactly. So, and this is we're going to constantly play with this tension between the individual and the collective, and the clan culture. Um, you introduce your clan first, and then yourself second. So it is even indicated in how we present our name. In our culture, it's first name, last name. Um, so yes. Yeah, and yeah, Ebony, you're right. Cultures around the world, you could find this dynamic, but ethnic groups of color, people of color tend to have indigenous populations in particular tend to have this value set, putting the group over the individual. Um, yeah. Anyway, more on that later. Um, so myths. Just a couple, they're all over the place. They're all around us. They can be told in on TV. Um, Star Trek is another great example that can be analyzed to death, and is analyzed to death. There's Wikipedia pages on the cultural influence of Star Trek. There's books on the cultural impact of Star Trek. In 1960s, when Star Trek came around, there was this big Cold War going on between the Soviet Union and America, and Star Trek fed into that, and what was that conflict actually helped create the storyline, much of the storyline for Star Trek back then. Also in the 1960s, a lot of things was happening was this notion of racial tensions and in society in America. And so here you have in Star Trek, you find the first interracial kiss happening on TV. So you look at that group of people of Star Trek, which is, I don't know which generation that is, but because I'm not a Star Trekker, but I am definitely appreciate for its value and the stories it told. But this, what is it that Star Trek, every expedition, what is it their mission is? What is often the story of what happens on their episodes?
They go to different cultures and learn about the different planets.
Yeah,
People.
and is there a conflict that typically happens?
I haven't watched a whole lot of Star Trek, but I feel like, yes, there's a lot of fighting, and I imagine it's often like they're trying to push their like democratic people on the whatever airplane that is. I mean spaceship.
Yeah.
But yeah.
The spaceship, the starship. Yeah. So
That's
there's
it.
they go to the new frontier. They're always going to a new frontier and interacting with people of difference or life forms of difference. And there's this assimilation or there's this conflict that typically happens, and a lot of times it's assimilation into the fold that transpires. But yeah, conflict resolution through assimilation is typically the end result. There's some sort of finding common ground. But anyway, so yeah, so I'm hoping there might be some track expert on here, but you know, you look at this group. They are of different color, and but they're all in a sense uniform, right? They're uniform but different. So you have this allowance for differences, but all packaged the same in a sense. So this is the dynamic of assimilation within our difference that Americans typically value. So then we'll talk about that versus multiculturalism, assimilation versus multiculturalism. That they are sort of night and day in conflict with each other sometimes. Football and sports. Here you have, you know, it is a violent sport for one thing. So the value of violence and war is played out on a field. But also you have in football you have individual players playing their parts as a unit, as a team. Specialization, something that another value that plays out on a football game. So this is definitely you know, very much a microcosm of Americana. Um, and yeah, Adam Bradley, from what I remember, there are a lot of episodes about what is considered right and wrong between people of Enterprise and whatever planet they go to. Yes, it's that conflict of values and value orientation. That's a very good point, and that's, you know, that's how we perceive ourselves in America as a whole, and often in contrast to other societies. And you know that you think about you know, Soviet Union during that period of time and still today, that was the big standoff. That was a huge standoff, and it kind of was playing out through Star Trek. So anthropology is a social science, and I put science in quotes for a reason, um, because science itself typically operates on a model of isolation. Whatever they're being studied is isolated and objectified, um, and that is something that with humans there's some ethical issues about putting humans in labs, right? But in anthropology, there is a long history of 19th century primarily in which anthropology, we used prisons and mental health facilities um, to make our calculations about groups of different types of people. And typically it was built on a hierarchy of Western Caucasian male with as the top of that hierarchy and the standard of what others are compared against. And so there was always this breakdown of whites at the top, Asian and African um, um, groups on a very hierarchical basis. So yes, we have anthropology as a discipline has evolved, and as a science and as a discipline, we no longer necessarily we try to break down hierarchies now. Actually, so we're trying to work against having what we call ethnocentrism, putting ourselves at the center, um, and what we are known for is asking questions. Um, Yes, yes, Nadia. What used to be based on racism, absolutely. The Orient, it was a product of its time, um, and we will explore that more in detail in the coming chapter, actually, chapter 2. So yes, it was a product of definitely racist ideology, scientific racism. Um, but our thing is today is about asking questions and questioning truths. So we question truths about racism. We question overgeneralizations about any group of people and assumptions. We question our own assumptions. This is really the essence of critical thought. It's questioning the information that we present to ourselves and that others present to us. Um, so where does that knowledge come from? Um, One of the things that we will that we have to be aware of is that when we have assumptions about others, this leads to deterministic thought that well, people are successful because their group is one thing. They're maybe more talented, or they're just meant to be successful because they deserve their privileges. Um, some people do work for their success, but there's a lot of folks who are born with that spoon to success, um, versus the perspective that it's by chance that they are born into that spoon of success. So the chance, the opportunities, where you're born presents you a set of opportunities, and deterministic thought of you're born into success and that family was meant to be for 500 years to be a legacy of leadership. Um, that's something that anthropology rubs against for sure. Um, we look for reasons for why certain individuals, certain groups are more successful than others, and to explain that. So anthropology is surrounded by disciplines that are sisters, and that we influence and that they influence us. And we have relationships to all these disciplines and more. Politics, political science, criminology, which is a subdiscipline of sociology, um, history, of course, and psychology. We look at motivation in individuals, linguistics, um, which has got its own discipline within anthropology, religion, biology, economics. A lot of these topics we're going to cover this semester. Um, there's one particular discipline that we have a very close relationship to, and that is sociology. Um, what is the what for those of I'm sure some of you have taken sociology. What's earlier I asked you what anthropologists study. A lot of people talk about culture. What is it that sociologists study?
Isn't it the psychology of an individual? Or is that the difference between psychology and sociology?
Exactly. That's the difference between sociology and psychology. Right. Exactly. Anybody? Somebody else? Somebody said study. Nadia said study of society.
This is sort of study how social groups work.
Okay. Yeah. So social groups. Individuals make up social groups. It's the end. So if we do want to talk about individual basis, it's the individual relationship to the social. Um, but social groups and but also something else there about groups when we talk about sociology, and that is social institutions, right? Social institutions. So systematic study of social behavior in human groups and their relations. So there is there's in Europe and in some institutions here in the United States, they call their anthropology study to be social and cultural anthropology, social culture anthropology. And it does. And so the interaction between social institutions, social groups, social institution and social groups, society, um, that is the carrier of culture. Culture, American society carries American culture. However, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of cultures that comprise American society. So you can't. It's hard to talk about one without talking about the other, to say the least. But there definitely are. They have a very strong relationship with each other. Um, any questions about the Sisters of Anthropology? So let's look at anthropology and what makes it unique. Um, it is a focus on culture. This is the essence of a lot of anthropology is looking at culture from a couple different angles, but sort of two different divide, one major divide to two different sides of culture, and that is some anthropologists focus on symbolism as this entranceway into a culture, the symbols of a culture. Another side looks at the material, the physicality of a culture. And the two are really important to look at both. It's hard to look at one without looking at the other. But there's entranceways, there's doorways that some anthropologists use that are primarily symbolism. Symbolism? What's an example of a symbolic culture or symbolism in a culture? Excuse me. What is a symbol that is important to our culture?
Like a flag.
Flag, yeah.
Okay.
Eagle.
Eagle.
Or
okay.
like,
Yeah, the flag, the eagle.
money.
Money. Okay.
Depending on where you are, who you are, the shared religious beliefs.
Yeah. So there's symbols in a religion, of course, the predominant, and Judeo-Christian is the cross, right? Um, and yeah, religion is filled with symbols. Now, some of these symbols are what we call emblems. They are very specific. Emblems are specific gestures, specific um, that really speak volumes. We'll talk about that when we get into chapter 4 in language. But yes, so those are symbolism. There's symbols all around us. And that's chapter 4 subject matter. Materialistic, on the other hand, everything around us physically that you see is part of our culture. Our houses, our homes, even our tables, our computers. It's everything around us is part of our culture, and they hold value. They hold, they're symbols with those physicalities too. So. Yeah, this world of symbolism and materialism are both important to the concept of culture. Anthropology holds what's called a holistic perspective, and notice how we spell holism there. It's HOL. Um, and not WHOL, holism. I like to read into that, and my interpretation is that there's always a whole in our perspective. There's always something we don't see. Um, so there's you never have a complete, no anthropologist can ever create an ethnography that is the defining, all-encompassing study of another culture, because you would have to talk to every single individual within that culture to understand the entire potential of it, because every individual in a culture has a different interpretation. So, but we intend within anthropology to round out our perspective of a culture as best as we can, from a larger perspective. Franz Boas kind of is considered to be the grandfather of American anthropology. We'll talk more about him later. He developed what's called a four-field approach, which is 4 subfields of anthropology, which is really looking at culture from 4 different angles, which we'll talk about. So anyway, yes, this is the holistic perspective, but also a comparative perspective is important. We learn about one culture by comparing it to other cultures in contrast and also in similarities, differences and similarities. And that's some of that I ask you to do in this class, actually. But what we're trying to do is not necessarily say there is a normal culture that everything needs to be compared against. What we're trying to do is to show that norms, there is no universal norm to culture, that all cultures are different, and that when you start to say, well, this is what really needs to be a culture, this is what we all need to be doing, that's when we get into some racism and some ethnocentrism. So anthropologists are about breaking down universal truths about others, and to understand why we do what we do and why others do what they do. Comparing cultures against each other, this is something that we find, that we understand, we deepen understanding that cultures are always changing. And the paradox is that if a culture doesn't change today, because how interwoven cultures are around the world, a culture will die. But anthropologists would like to see cultures actually to be preserved, because there's definitely values and practices that are still important to groups, and so a lot of the irony is that you have to change in order to continue to survive. Any questions about this? All right, so there's 4 different fields in anthropology. We're here to study culture anthropology. We're going to look at the other 3 fields after we look first at cultural. And again, this is a glance. This is a foreshadowing of what we're going to be covering later on in the semester. So this is just a quick surface. This is what's to come sort of thing. But culture anthropology has got a couple different vehicles, one of which is ethnography. It's the primary vehicle for understanding other cultures. In ethnography, we practice what we call interviews and participant observation and ethnology. Interviews are the tool for the primary tool for culture anthropologists to conduct ethnography. It is going into a culture and talking individually to people in a culture to understand their experiences. We also will take on a role inside that culture and put on a hat that gives us a place in that culture to be able to observe others. So when I was going into the prison, I went in as a educator. I was helping teach and facilitate nonviolence workshops called Alternative to Violence Project, AVP. I became a facilitator inside of San Quentin, and alongside other prisoners who were also becoming facilitators. So I actually participated in workshops in a prison in order to be able to become a facilitator of those workshops. Prisoners were doing the same thing, and so I had that hat on, and I was observing at the same time what prisoners were doing, and I was listening, interviewing them on the side, and talking to them about their experiences in prison. So that's participant observation. One thing of important note, I can't talk about that without mentioning, you always tell people that you are observing them and that you're an anthropologist. You're not in secret doing this. You're completely transparent. How do you, that's a very good question. You don't. You have bias, and that bias is something you recognize, and you bring it out, you bring it to the forefront. It is what you recognize up front. This is who I am. This is my perspective, and this is my experience of studying these other folks. So we in a sense, we take out that bias by recognizing it up front, and that for the reader or for the viewer who is watching the fruits of anthropology, they have that awareness as they are experiencing your research. So that, more on that later. That's a very good question. We also have what's called ethnology. Ethnology is what we talked about just a minute ago. It's the comparison of cultures. I feel like that is secondary to as far as the toolkit, the toolbox of interviews and participant observation. That's more of preparing for going into an interview or into another culture, or after you've gone into a culture, you open up and you compare it to other cultures. So it's a passive tool. So ethnography. And one thing that we have learned in time is that today there really is no culture that has not been touched by Western society. And so there are no more necessarily isolated cultures out there. I think despite what you will see on the internet, and even if it's like a culture that might have been isolated from direct contact, indirectly their resources have been impacted in some way by Western society. That's how globalized and reach and deep in reach Western society has evolved. So what we tend to focus on is how to preserve indigenous populations and indigenous cultures, indigenous ways of life, helping preserve language and helping indigenous populations with resources so that they can continue to survive. And we also engage in what's called backyard anthropology. I would describe myself as a backyard anthropologist because I study the prison system of Western society. So that's basically, because we don't have the new frontier necessarily. There's no isolated islands out there anymore. We focus on ourselves. And not only that, it's interesting is that now indigenous people are focusing on us, and they're studying us as I think that's quite appropriate. They're turning the gaze back on us, and that is I think well needed. So there is a historical timeline that you can place on the evolution of anthropological thought in our experience of people of difference, and you could say that that our first orientation, the most ethnocentric orientation that goes Western thought, goes to Aristotle's doctrine of natural slavery, which says that basically you have the head of the household, the man, the Caucasian man, the wife, the children, and the slave underneath that hierarchy. is something that, and that framework of perceiving other people of difference was carried forward by um, Western people, all the way up to, you could say, Charles Darwin. So the influence on the early exploration, European explorations of the world, was definitely, that was the framework. Darwin shifted that a little bit. Darwin, his perspective portrayed in the, or presented in the Origin of Natural Selection, said that basically all life forms, all plants and animals, we are responding to our environment. And so people are responding to their environment, and they use their culture to adapt to their environment. Well, his point was that we shouldn't put a hierarchy on a group in Africa versus a group in Europe. That how Africans are responding to their environment is different than Europeans responded to their environment. But what happened was that our ethnocentrism, our putting our centers at ourself, was basically just changed and shifted a little bit, because basically Europeans and Westerners said, well, what Darwin's saying is true. We're evolving in relationship to our environment, but those that have evolved to produce food in agriculture are civilized. Those that are living hunting and gatherers are savages. Those that are doing rudimentary gardening are barbarians. So they put a different hierarchy on this spin that Charles Darwin, definitely in a sense, bastardized Darwin to a hierarchy that served the Europeans of the time. So then you progress into the 20th century, early 20th century. Franz Boas, who was a German that migrated to America, we'll talk a little bit more about him. He came up with this perspective that he used. He was a fan of Darwin, but he used Darwin's theory to talk about, well, cultures are adapting to their environment, and that just makes them different. It doesn't make one group better than the other. And he recognized ethnocentrism. He brought that to light, and cultural relativity, which says that our cultures are all relative to who we are, and the logic behind what we do. There is a logic, and you should not put a hierarchy on it. So we're going to go much more deeper into that than this very 1 minute explanation, but this is in essence what we're talking about. Are there any questions at this point? Okay. Well, linguistic is another. So we have 4 fields. We have cultural, we have linguistics, we have archaeology, and we have applied. I'm sorry, archaeology, linguistic, physical, what we call biocultural, and applied. So we have 4 fields, but there's a 5th that we reference as applied, but it's not really its own field. It's kind of, it depends upon the other 4 fields for its existence. So some people give it its own field. Linguistics is the study of language, of course, and this is chapter 4. Culture is language, language is culture. And language itself, it is a vehicle for communicating to the next generation the culture. So culture is essential for language is essential for a culture to continue to exist. It is the avenue for existence for a culture. But also the content of culture and what is expressed in culture, how it's expressed in culture, is through language. Language itself can be analyzed on a cultural level. It's not just a vehicle for culture, it is culture as well. So when we talk about language, we can talk about it from a structural perspective. Again, chapter 4, we'll look at this a little bit closer. Mathematically, language can be diagnosed in its structural components. and there are some that will say that universally you can break down language and compare languages universally based upon the structures. There's some conflict about that within anthropology. We asked the question of how do languages change based upon the social context. So you yourself operate within the American English language. However, how you operate within that language changes, it shifts as your social context changes. From school, you might go to a religious institution for worship or for study, then to your family, then to your friends, then to the internet, and you're always shifting and putting on a different layer to your languaging. So your context, and this is looked at in sociolinguistics, looking at African Americans versus Caucasian Americans versus Asian Americans versus people of poverty, people of wealth. The context, how it changes in your group relationship, your group, your identity with that group changes how you speak. So another big question in linguistic anthropology is how languages change over time. You can really look at, yes, okay, John, here we go. Well-timed comment. Are we going over Proto-Indo-European? We will look at it on it, and of course we can't. There's so much of language that has to be is. Let me tell you, there's people that have that spend years and years and years studying language, and so we're taking one chapter 1 week, and we're going to glance at Proto-Indo-European language, which is the root family of our language, of the English language that we share with hundreds of other languages as well. So yeah, you look at the tracing of languages. This is one avenue that you could take in linguistic anthropology is, looking at Native American languages. There was one group that crossed over the Bering Strait that populated all of North and South America, Central, South, and North America, and so that one group, their language that they brought over was that proto language, the pre-existing language that populated and changed and morphed over populations, over time, over geographic continent. So yes, this is one of the other avenues of consideration for linguistics. Questions about language before we jump a whole nother subfield? Archaeology. How many history folks do we have here? How many have we got any history majors? Somewhat. Yeah. Well, there's definitely John is the only one I can see, so he's got his hand sort of wavering.
More geology than archaeology.
Okay. Well, history and archaeology have somewhat of a rivalry with each other. Because you have in history you have 5,000 years of written language that is relied upon for information, right? This is the interpretation of history. That's what historians do, interpretation of the written word. Well, archaeologists say, well, actually, who wrote that? And their answer is, well, it's most likely if you go back, not too far down back, if you go back a couple hundred years, you realize it's the elite that were able to write. So you go back even further, thousands of years, it's really a small minority elite that could write stuff down. So it was their perspective of existence. And anthropologists, we come with the evidence, we come with the artifacts. And archaeology is about digging up the artifacts of extinct societies, but even more recently too. I mean, it's something that it's definitely not just necessarily focused on prehistoric, but even more recently. But within prehistoric analysis, we can look at one artifact and analyze it for, was this a tool? Was this a product of for agriculture, for trading? It tells a story. One artifact can tell an amazing story, and that's what archaeologists are great at. They take the artifacts and they build a picture, and that picture helps present us a larger story. And you look at a skeleton, and it's not just a skeleton. You can analyze the value, the healthiness of that skeleton, and tell the story of that individual based upon potential. Was this somebody that was a commoner? Was this somebody that worked hard? Was it diseased? So again, we get a little bit more. We get into this a little bit more in physical anthropology as well. But the gold mine for archaeology is human waste site, and when you find human waste as an archaeologist, it is because you think about what is it that we throw away. It tells so much about a group of people. And look at ourselves. What are people going to think about us if us still exist? If people still exist in 1,000 years or 500 years or 100 years, what are they going to think about what we throw away today? Sit with that. I mean, think about our recent, the most recent phone that we just purchased, and what do we do with that old phone? This is. Believe me, recycling is so important. It cannot be, anyway. Don't get me on my binge on that. But what we throw away says a lot about what we value and what we do, our behavior, our actions, etc. So, archaeology. Any questions about archaeology? We teach archaeology here at Chattanooga State in the fall. I don't teach it yet. I don't teach it. Archaeology is the one field that I haven't approached yet as a teacher. We have a really good adjunct that's teaching it, so she'll be teaching it again in the fall if you're interested. I teach physical in the spring and cultural. So, speaking of physical anthropology is, like I mentioned in the last class, it is my favorite of all the subjects of anthropology today, even though I'm a cultural anthropologist. Physical anthropology is also references biological. Biological is the direction of this subdiscipline of anthropology, because it used to be this subfield was called the stones and bones, the study of stones and bones, basically, because that's all we had to go by, is the evidence that were being uncovered in the ground. But today we have the DNA, the genetics, and sort of the cellular world, which is the study of biology. And so biology is becoming I should probably make a movement to actually change the title of that course at Chattanooga State to biological anthropology, because that's what it's known as in other colleges and universities. But what biological physical anthropologists tend to focus on is what's called biocultural evolution. Biocultural evolution is the interaction between our biology and culture and how they influence each other. And it's a dance. There's a definite dance that's happening between the two. But in essence, what we're doing there physically is an adaptation to our environment. So our culture is adapting to our environment. Now, basically, what's happened though is our culture the environment is adapting to our culture, because the environment is changing because of our culture, and it's imposing on new cycles of seasons because of our culture. So physical anthropology, the study of human origins, biological diversity, and evolution through primates, the fossil record, and DNA. So we take those three things: monkeys, chimps, the apes, that is, and as one group that we focus on, We look at the fossil record and the 7 million year history of the fossil record, and we look at DNA in cells. So about that 7 million year history, prehistory, the very first human ancestor was found in Central Africa, South Central Africa. The name was Sahelanthropus chadensis. It was dated at about 7 million years ago. And so every time there's a new find, there is a new piece to the puzzle. So what's great about physical anthropology is that finds are happening. DNA the understanding of DNA is changing. And so the story that anthropologists can tell through this discipline changes. We know through DNA analysis that we share 98% of our DNA is the same as a chimp and a bonobo. Those are apes. They're not monkeys. They're apes, and we are an ape. We are of the great apes, and we share 98% of the DNA. We're about 96% with gorillas, I believe, 95, 96% with gorillas. But through DNA, we now know that, we've known through the fossil record, Sahelanthropus chadensis, we could see the patterns of our physicality, of our bone structure, was very similar to the great apes. And we knew physically through bone shape, morphology, that we were very similar to apes back in the day. But now we know DNA gives us evidence that our cousins are the great apes. This is to apply this kind of study to modern day. We can look at how agriculture has influenced our biology. So farming is something that has we'll see. We'll talk a little bit more about this. Farming techniques came about 12 to 13,000 years ago. But in Africa, farming techniques evolved about 2,400 years ago in Western Africa. And as a result, populations increased. And through the population increase, well, if you know about farming, you cut down a lot of trees to farm land. And so when they cut down trees, they created flat land that developed puddles of water that attracted mosquitoes. When the mosquitoes carry in that region of the world, malaria. So out of that response to the malaria, the sickle cell evolved. And if you've heard of sickle cell anemia, it's an early death sentence for people who develop it. So that death sentence is given if you have one parent with a sickle cell. If you have two parents with sickle cell, if they contribute to you as an individual, and you have one from your parent, one your mother, and one from your father, that gives you a double dose of sickle cell, it's an early death sentence. But now if only one parent is carrying the sickle cell trait, then it actually, and the other parent does not, it actually helps build up immunity to malaria. So sickle cell was a successful trait to ward off the effects of or the influence of malaria. Of course, malaria is one of the biggest killers in the world today. There's also food like lima beans and sorghum in that region of the world that helps fight off symptoms of malaria as well. So yeah, this is when we talk about bioculture evolution, you have the culture of agriculture, which is something that is a product of human beings, and you have the biology of our sickle cell, the genetic sickle cell, that are in relationship to each other. And this is a great example of bioculture evolution. And you can go through, I've got, our bodies have changed as we've adapted to colder climates. And speaking of agriculture, we also started to domesticate animals around, not far off from when agriculture evolved. We started to domesticate animals as well. And we started drinking the milk of other animals, and that changed for those of us who have for thousands of years been drinking cow milk or goat milk. We built up a resistance to the effects of it, and for those who have not evolved with, like in Africa, where you have 99% of people who are lactose intolerant because they did not have domesticated animals like Europeans did. So again, you have this domestication of animals, which is a cultural product, and you have the physicality of lactose intolerant versus lactose tolerance as a result. There is this biocultural dance that takes place, right? All right, I've taken you to the end of the class, and I believe we are at the end of what I want to cover for today, but we're going to stop here and start with applied anthropology, talk about it, and then go into chapter 2 immediately after that. Watch a little bit of a documentary, I think, on Thursday. Oh yes, and we will talk about the paper as well. So we've got lots to do on Thursday. I will hang out for another minute. If anybody has any questions, we'll see everybody else on Thursday. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, you too, Professor.
Thank you. Have a good day. Enjoy the
Thank
sunshine.
you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.